Hello and welcome to today's Berkeley Center event, River Missionaries, Deforestation, and COVID-19, held in partnership with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. We'd like to first thank our colleagues at the Pulitzer Center for our continued robust partnership. Our event today will feature Rodrigo Pedrosa, a Brazilian journalist who reports for CNN. As part of the Pulitzer Center's Rainforest Journalism Fund, his project, River Missionaries, the Catholic Counteroffensive in the Amazon, explores the dynamics and work of Catholic missionaries in an area where evangelical Christians and the theology of prosperity are booming alongside deforestation. In this conversation, Pedrosa will share the stories of parishes struggling to survive and missionaries who serve hard-to-reach villages in the Amazon region. He will be joined by Nyansa Spellman, founder and CEO of Rainforest Partnership, and the two will discuss the role of religious communities in combating deforestation, as well as how Catholic, Indigenous, and local communities in the Amazon have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The dialogue will be moderated by Reverend Fletcher Harper, an Episcopal priest and the executive director of Green Faith. Reverend Harper is a leader in the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative and helps spearhead the faith-based fossil fuel divestment movement. He organizes faith turnouts at major climate mobilizations and is a co-founder of SHINE, an international campaign that supports women and community-led renewable energy access initiatives in Africa and India. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to the event page on the Berkeley Center's website very soon, usually within a week. If you registered for today's event, you'll receive an email when the video becomes available. After our moderated conversation, we'll have a Q&A with a Zoom audience. Please submit your questions by opening the little Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you can type in your question there. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Reverend Harper. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael, and welcome everyone. It's good to be with you. And as we start our conversation today, I'd like to ask you to imagine that you are entering a different kind of territory, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, morally. A landscape in which we're going to experience today through the stories and the insights of our presenters, a collision of different worldviews and of different worlds, and a collision that's got great significance for the people involved at the frontline level, but also for the entire planet. Ultimately, we all know that the survival of tropical forests, and thereby the survival of the planet as we know it, depends on the protection of the rights and cultures of these forests' indigenous guardians. And we also know, though perhaps it's not said directly enough, that one of the great threats to the rights of these peoples and these forests is incursions of different forms of religion, incursions which make many of us who are people of faith profoundly uncomfortable, and which we need to reckon with directly and openly. And that's what we're going to be able to do today in this conversation. And I'd like now to welcome and introduce our two speakers. As Michael said, Rodrigo Pedrosa is a Brazilian journalist, reports for CNN. He has a considerable amount of experience on the front lines in these communities. He's covered post-conflict issues in Colombia, and he currently reports on social and political issues in the Amazon. And he has a Pulitzer Center funded Amazon rainforest journalism project, which is titled River Missionaries, the Catholic Counteroffensive in the Amazon. After Rodrigo speaks and shares, we're also really fortunate to be hearing today from Nyansa Spellman, who's the founder and CEO of Rainforest Partnership, a US headquartered international nonprofit dedicated to protecting tropical rainforests. So Rodrigo, without any further delay, The microphone is to you, and we look forward to what you're going to share. And you're on mute.
Oh, that happens. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Reverend, for this great introduction. Hi, Nyanta. Thanks, everyone, for attending this speech and this talk. And I'm looking forward to have a really meaningful conversation about this great subject. Well, I'd like to start talking about this one story about a missionary, a Catholic missionary. She's called Marta Rueda. She's from Mexico. I was living in the remote area of the Amazon a year and a half ago, and near the Amazon River in the triple border between Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. So I was I got my attention to the point which is every village I went to visit, I saw one Catholic chapel, which would be not used, seem like abandoned with time, and often in front of that chapel, an evangelical one, new builded, and often bigger, etc. So it got my attention. Then I started to ask people, indigenous people, well, what's happened? I mean, why do you have this one Catholic building and an evangelical one? And with in some village, they would say like, well, the Catholics went here and they built us a school and they built us a chapel, but then went off. We don't have priests anymore. And then the evangelicals in the early 2000 went here and built this church, and they started to preach the God's work. So now the majority of the community is evangelical. So that got my attention. I said, well, why is that happening? What's taking place in this region that people are trading in a way their Christian faith? And then at the time, the Pope was holding Catholic synodite. And that synodite was about the Amazon. So everything I got together, they said, I want to question this answer. I want to answer this question about why the Catholic kind of abandoned those places. And I started talking to some priests in Colombia, and then say to me, you have to go to Peru, because in Peru we have this little town called Cabariococha, and Cabariococha have 5 nuns, women, that work there alone to attend the whole community. And then you can understand what this is all about. So I went there and I spent a week with them. And I got more close with a nun called Marta Rueda. She's from Mexico, from the south of Mexico, grew up in a very poor Catholic family. And she was in the region for the past 3 years, trying to spread the God's word to those population. The majority of them is indigenous. And then with the days passing by, she started to tell me all the struggles and difficulties that she had. So first it was the weather, too humidity, too moist and too sunny, and the communities were too far away. And some communities you have to go 10 hours in a boat together, etc. And after that, the food was very different, and she was having a hard time because there in Mexico the food was better, etc. But after we get acquaintance, she started to get more deep and said, you know, I have a problem here that people believe in God halfway. They don't go all through the way to believe in him. And I said, why? Why do you think that's happened? She said, I don't know. But I have the sense that I talk to the walls, because I throw them the God spell, I throw them the God words, and they turn their back and do the opposite thing on their daily lives. And now I'm having a really hard time to understand that. Why people doesn't believe in God the way I do. She started to question herself. And I thought that was a really deep question, because she was in her mid-30s and she has been a nun for the past 2 decades, 1 decade and a half. And she was beginning to question the way she was doing her work. But after that, she started to question if her work was really somewhat meaningful, because she couldn't see any results. And then I spent another day with her, went to this little community so she could show me the way she was working with the Catholic rituals among the indigenous rituals. So the local people, they were Yagua, indigenous people. They would show me kind of ritual, syncretic ritual. And then after they did this dance, and they celebrate kind of a mass, and they prayed a little. I went to talk to the chief of the village. and I said to him, well, what's your expectation on this work that's being done in the community? And he said, for the past 30 years, we have missionaries and Catholic priests going on here in our village, and we attend them. And then they taught us the word of God, and we learn. And we think that's nice, and we like the God, and we think that God exists. But I said, okay, but why you don't go through it? Why you believe also in the god of rain and the god of the river and all other deities that you have? And he said, well, my father, before he got in contact, the first priest, he was living way down in the jungle. I was born right in this village that was created by the priest of this little town that Marta Red was living, it's Cabardicocha. And I can't see why I have to abandon one faith to have another. That doesn't make sense to me. And then after that visit we made, we was getting back to the river to get the boat to get to the Cabardicocha again. We were followed by some local young people from the community that went with us. They were also attending the church, and they were singing chants and being kind of silly, etc. And Marta Aurelio turns to me and said, well, I question myself a lot what I'm doing here, because I don't see a lot of sense in my work, because I don't see the results. But when I see people like this, I tend to just relax and to trust that in a way God's work is being done. So cut that from today. So I talked to her like a week ago, okay? It was like 2 years ago. And I said to her, oh, Marta, how are you? Where are you? How things are, etc. I said to me, oh, Rodrigo, I'm in Mexico now. I said, well, what happened? Yeah, I went back to my family. And I said, why did you left Cabardicocha? She said, well, it was hard for me. I was feeling trapped in a daily routine. I thought that my work wasn't being going the way I want to. And now with the COVID hit Cabardicocha really hard. Some of people that I know died of COVID. The public authorities in Peru did nothing. The only institution that worked there was the church. We were able to provide some oxygen cylinders to the local community, etc. So I couldn't handle that anymore. So I asked to be transferred to Mexico again. And then I talked to her, okay, but do you feel at ease now? Like you feel more in connection with God and if you work there, and if, if you work there in Mexico? She said, well, I think so. And she generally looking more happy. She looked more relaxed in a way. So what I'm trying to tell of that experience, of that story that I was following, it was all of those difficulties that you face when you go to a really not known environment for us from the big cities and from outside the jungle and the rainforest. And second, how it's hard to work with conscience. It's hard for one to just go to other people and say, that's the way. You have to believe in that. And missionaries often clash with that. They have to adapt, they have to mold, and they have to find new ways to really do the work, because if they're not flexible, they will bend and they will break in a way. So, and that's what I kind of learned from her and from the nuns in Cabardicocha.
Thanks, Rodrigo. And it's a rich and intense story in a number of ways, because you can feel the tensions in what's going on many different levels. And I wonder, Nianta, how what does this evoke for you? I'm sure it evokes many things, but you've worked directly with indigenous communities in the tropical forests for many years. You're well aware, as Rodrigo is also, of the rich culture and heritage, millennial old, that they have. What does this evoke for you? And you're on mute also.
So many things, but the story that Rodrigo tells makes me think of a woman I met in 2012. early in the morning, I had to present before a Rotary Club in Dallas about Rainforest Partnership. I'd been invited. It was really early in the morning. I think almost all men. And one of the people come back to me after and said, "You have to go meet this woman. She loves the rainforest. She spent time in the rainforest. She was a missionary." And I needed to get back to Austin. So for any of you that are watching, it's about a 3-hour drive from Dallas to Austin. There was a huge thing that was happening in my life that week, a medical related issue. But something about the person compelled me that I should go meet with this woman. It was sort of on my way. So I do. Turns out this woman, she's in her 80s now, and she had gone as a missionary to the Amazon with her husband and children when she was a young bride of 22 or 23, I think it was, in 1952. Very few people went and did such things. And we talked for a couple of hours and we bonded. And at the end, she kept saying, "I understand where my passion comes from." And she still cared about the forest and the community and her son. And she'd written books, children's books about rainforests, very central to who she was years after coming back. And she kept saying, "My passion comes from the rainforest. I mean, from Jesus Christ. My passion for life and what I did comes from Jesus Christ." And she says, "Where does your passion come from? I don't understand." And she kept saying this for half an hour. And it was odd because we used very similar language. She was right. She was this very strong, born-again Christian, very strong in her beliefs. Why she went, it was to take the word of God to the middle of the jungle in a time when nobody traveled and did that. You did not take your family and just go in the middle of the jungle. And I often thought about that, but Rodrigo's story made me think about it. Who goes to the forest, whether it is somebody like me or Rodrigo, or somebody who's compelled by their religious faith, that we have a passion of some sort. But here's the thing that's really important from my point of view, that how do we go? How do we present ourselves? Are we imposing our views in a very colonial, old way that happened for millennia? Or are we going and saying, here's what we know, here's who we are, here's what you're doing, you who are living in the forest, in harmony with the forest, which most communities do, indigenous and local communities do live in harmony, not all. That's another sort of, we like to glorify things, it's not always the case. But you who are, the fact that you're protecting these forests that are part of God's creation, if that's how we believe our planet was created, or even if we believe it was, it evolved and got to this place. Here's this planet that is beautiful with these magical forests that play disproportionate role in the balance and well-being of our planet. And you who are living in the forest, protecting it for yourselves and for the rest of us. What can we do by coming to you, and what can we offer? And when missionaries or from any religious faith go and offer and say, our faith compels us to come be side by side and help you, or NGOs like us go and say, we want to, but not impose, invite perhaps. I'm okay with inviting, but not imposing. I think that is what allows for the exchange to happen. And there's a role that religious organizations play, just as NGOs play, just as corporations play, just as governments play, as communities together by themselves play. And so I think that's what makes me think about it. And I think, Reverend Fletcher, you, Rodrigo, you heard me talk about it last week. I mean, I grew up with, Mother Teresa's mission was the third mission in the town I grew up in. I grew up, that being very much part of my life. And many other things I talked about, right? Different religions being part of my life. I didn't feel anybody imposing. And the respect that we feel towards something that an Indigenous community believes. Very small story to add, and I'm watching time. So I'm in the community, I get sick. And I ask, what do you think it is? I'm really sick to the stomach. And somebody whose father was shaman of the medicine kind, and mother, who was grandfather, was this amazing big shaman of positive energy kind, and taught his mother, which is quite a rare thing to have women as shamans. He says to me, depends if it's physical or a negative energy related thing. And so I say, what? And he comes and brings me this tea and he says, drink this. So of course, respecting, we've bonded, I drink it. For the next 3 days, I had the worst diarrhea ever. And here's the funny thing. I couldn't drink, I couldn't eat, and I had normal energy. And so I thought, were you cleansing me? What was it? Biologically, that shouldn't have happened. I was troweling through the forest. You know what it's like. What are the secrets and the connections that people in the forest have that we don't even begin to understand? And if the forest is, for a lot of Indigenous communities, they are the forest. It's both their home, but they're part of the forest. And of course, they're part of the ecosystem. And everything is connected. When you go to church or in any other, people talk about feeling that connection to God, to this higher power. When you're in the forest, you feel that connection. Is that our church or temple if you're an Indigenous person, or if you're one that's awakened and connected? And, if that's the case, then how you deal with things matters a great deal, and how you see life, how you view life, how you respect and interact, how you encroach or visit. It matters a great deal, whether you impose or not. So I'll stop there.
Well, and it's fascinating because you both raise such fundamentally important questions that operate on so many levels. I mean, my sense is that the audience for this conversation is well aware that the activity of Christian missionaries is often connected to really damaging outcomes for Indigenous communities and for the forests themselves. We certainly at Green Faith are aware in our work that these more fundamentalist religious expressions are very often quite closely allied with extractive industrial interests and more authoritarian forms of government. Those are large-scale patterns, but often they do play out. So there's a meta level in terms of the public construction of the world. Then there's also this sort of profoundly inner dimension to this that is at the heart of what really does make us human. And are we made human by one expression of religion or another? And how does that actually happen? Rodrigo, you both have spent so much time sort of right in the nexus of these forces. What further thoughts do you have? What should we be thinking about as public people and leaders, and as we do our work around these issues? What would you teach us?
That's a really good question, and I don't think I have much to teach. I can express my views and my experience, and it's a really, really good question, because when you have such an encounter, we start to question a lot, because it's kind of a mirror. It reflects you upon time. I think it's at the end of the day, it's more like a clash of subjectivities, because you have this one way of being in the world, interacting with the world, and that also feeds your inner self. in those communities, which is really different from our world, which is a more modern kind of really consumerist, materialistic way of being in the world, and that clashes all the time, even in minimal things. I think the difference is your stance, your posture towards this clash that will happen. Don't fool yourself. You go there, we'll have a lot of idealizations, then we romanticize some things, and in reality, you go just throw your things in your face and have to do with that. Good and bad. It's not a matter of labeling things as good and bad also. You see reality and need to throw your things. And what makes a difference, in my experience, it's how you interact with those things and how you internalize those things also. I know it can be kind of philosophical what I'm saying, but the thing is, if you go too strict, you will break because it's a clash of how you perceive the world, and it's a really hard thing to grasp if you don't experience that. How you can say someone that really thinks that the river is her mother to say that it isn't? How can you interact with that, and how you can interact with such a level of poverty that you can see a mother selling her son because she don't have money to feed the other brothers that her son has. So when you see those things, you start to question a lot of things. More than answers, you get out of those experiences with questions, and to have I would say a proper stance on it, a posture to be open and to listen. But really listen, because it's hard for us also to listen because we tend to discredit because it looks like foolishness sometimes. You know what I mean? Like if someone offers you a tea and said, "Oh, you have this flu because I don't know, it rained and the rain when it hits the ground got to the air some particles and you breathe that and you get the flu." So, no, it doesn't happen this way, but for them it is. So if you don't really listen what's behind those words and what is behind those postures and behaviors, you won't understand and you clash and you will eventually break. So I'd say you have to really be an open posture and don't judge too much, because if you do so, you won't understand. And the second thing, just to finish, for the second thing, it's more about thinking about who you are in the end of the day, because those things kept being thrown at your face, and you have to analyze how you behave, how you react, and that will teach you a lot about who you are.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And let me, Nyanta, passing to you, let me dig a little bit deeper, because we've used language during this conversation about sort of encounter and collision. But again, those of us on this call know that very often, most often, the case over the past 500 plus years has actually not just been an encounter or a collision, it's resulted at varying levels in extermination of indigenous peoples and cultures. And so I think it's a mistake to use a frame that this is a sort of cultural exchange. And I know that none of us was doing that. But how, Nyanta, how do you see this? I mean, you work to try to help bridge this gap in so many ways. What have you learned from that?
I think
what should we learn?
the number one thing is, humility is so important. And if we step back just for a moment and think about, put ourselves in a position that we in this Western world know a great deal. We've now we're trying to talk about sending people on Mars, and we've just converted Martian atmosphere into breathable oxygen, and we're trying to fly a little helicopter on Mars. Great. We've sent man to the moon. We've done all sorts of stuff. We do not know our very own backyard. We think we do. We don't. And when you go to the forest, it is so full of life. I had a couple of friends who are geologists, and one of my friends, actually, she trains astronauts on Earth geology somewhere in near Taos. And she's looking, they're in the boat with me, and they both say, here, more is more. They're just looking at everything in the forest. And they're saying, more is more. And it is. When you have that much, and when you have people who've just grown up, they know things innately about that forest, how the interactions work. So I'll give you one quick example. Just to illustrate, there was a study being done, and surveys. There was a nonprofit that went in and did a whole bunch of surveys of every kind about, the trees and then the insects, and they actually did butterflies by themselves, and they did big mammals, small mammals, amphibian surveys, and for 3 summers in a row, and they found amazing things. But each person was paired with somebody native from the community. Now, most of them, the older gentleman was just really, even the language he was using was just so derogatory towards community members. But he was a 21-year-old son of 2 people I know, called Bill, my husband's Bill, assigned to this young Irish woman. And you know what she said? They were only using Latin names and indigenous names because they weren't even going to try any Spanish names or anything else. There were about 600 trees that they went and identified. And she said he knew the name of every one of them by sight. He's 21 years old. The only thing he's had is a high school diploma. Who is the expert? The woman who's gone to college? Who's the presumed expert in our Western world's point of view, right? Because she's going, that publication comes out, it's going to be her name. Who knew his stuff? Just by growing up and learning from his father and grandfather and mother and grandmother and uncles, just being in the forest and all those interactions. When is something going to germinate? When is something flowering? How does it cure something? We know nothing about our own backyard. And we make all sorts of assumptions. And at a time when we're dealing with something like COVID, don't you think we might want to invite some of these indigenous people and say, what do you know? Look, we really think we understand that you know things innately without even thinking about it. And that you don't even know what you know because it's just part of who you are. And we've been making assumptions when we come in that we're the experts, we're the scientists, we come and collect data. No, we don't. We know very little. And when you think about it, and I have seen something, this is all anecdotal, so do not quote me on this, but our communities that are relying on traditional medicine and going back to the traditional medicine, I've noticed that they're actually doing okay with COVID. But the ones that are closer and at the edge of our Western civilization, they've had COVID cases. And I am wondering about it, right? I cannot, it's almost blasphemous to say that probably, but is there something going on? Here's something else that happened. One of my community members was actually beaming saying, we've had no COVID cases because we're using our ancestral knowledge. And if I said it too loudly publicly, there would be these pharmaceutical companies running in saying, what are you doing? How can we capitalize on it? And we'd be dealing with biopiracy issues. But there is so much going on that there's so much about our own planet that we don't understand the interactions. And if we started from a point and a place of humility and say, yes, we know a lot. We've advanced technology and we've done all sorts of things. We can have fancy gear and end up in the forest. But what do our forest communities know that they can teach us today that could change the trajectory of our shared future on this planet? And I think they have a lot to teach us, if only we were willing to ask and listen and respect in a way that that grandfather is going to pass on that knowledge to that son and to that grandchild, rather than saying all that is crap and you need to just throw it away and ignore and make them feel so shameful that a lot of young people do not want to self-identify as Native or otherwise. And sometimes in the middle of the jungle, somebody will say, why do you care? Why? And to be able to the very small thing about working with forest communities to know that the rest of the world actually depends on that forest and their success in protecting it, I think it's a big thing. And we owe them a lot of gratitude, really, and support and help. So I'll stop. I could talk forever about these things.
Thank you. And I wonder, we're starting to get some questions in the Q&A box, and I'd encourage everybody who has a question to click on that box and share your question, and we'll do our best to get to them. So I'll start to work with some of those questions, and one of them is a really good one about a clash of religious worldviews, an interpretation of Christianity that talks about humankind having dominion over the earth, as compared to a second creation story within Christianity that talks about humanity cultivating and caring for the garden, and then an indigenous worldview, which more often than not truly views humanity as part of an extended kin network within the wider natural world. And what is I see in our work an enormous hunger for people to be able to experience a profound religious appreciation for the natural world at the heart of their identity and the heart of their religious and moral beliefs. And I wonder, Rodrigo and Nyanta, as you think about what you feel that you've learned, religiously or not, but in terms of your own life philosophy, where have each of you felt yourselves growing most, or your perspective expanding the most as in the work that you've done and in the encounters that you've had?
Well, I'll be honest. I was schooled and I grew up as a Catholic, and my whole life I was in just one school that was administered by Catholic nuns, like Marta Rueda, and I spent all my life there, and as teenager and kid. But I was also very skeptical because I couldn't fit the model, and it was too authoritarian and too strict. And then those issues wasn't an issue for me, like religious one, when I was a young adult or teenager. But after I went after this living in the Amazon and living with those people with different ways of being in the world, what changed my perspective is just one assumption that's really hard to grasp, but once you grasp it, it changes a lot. When you really understand that a leaf is the same thing as a cloud, that's the same thing as a human being, that's the same thing as a turtle, that's the same thing as a drop of water, that's the same thing as a thunder, the way you look at the world and your presence in the world really changes. And it's at first you see like, that doesn't make any sense. Like a leaf is the same deity as a thunder, as a human being. That doesn't make any sense. Like I'm seeing a net here. I can just go and put my finger in a net, and that's it. I don't understand that coming from like this urban, modern city background. You know what I mean? It just doesn't make any sense. But when you experience that and you start to live with that perspective and live among people that not only see things that way, but interact with things in that way, that starts to make a little bit more sense. Whether it's not about like, oh, I'm gonna get a fish and I don't kill a fish, I don't eat a fish, or I just have to pray a lot before I kill a fish. It's not about it. It's having respect, because everything is intertwined. And it really is. You can see that more clearly in the rainforest, but you can see that in everything. I'm from São Paulo, which is the biggest city of Brazil, and we have 2 rivers in São Paulo. They're all died. They're all dead. I mean, for me, it's like I grew up in a city that had 2 big rivers that are dead for the last 40 years, and no one questions that. And it's part of the routine. You go by side, you have these big highways in São Paulo that's called marginals, big highways with like 10 lanes each side of the road. And you get the summer, the smell is so hideous that you have to close down your window because it really smells bad. And no one questions that. It's just normal part of the environment to live with two dead rivers on our backyard because that's the price. We are so we are starting to realize that's not okay to live like that. So I think that for me, what is the most I don't know, meaningful thing that I'm trying to grasp and I start to really incorporate in my way of being is that if things are interconnected and if you don't respect that order, you won't respect nothing. If you don't know how important it is to really respect a tree or your river or just a small being that's living in your backyard, you can't respect bigger things. And it's kind of, it feels like a little bit, I don't know, demagogical or kind of cliche, those things. And it is to a certain extent because cliches had some big truth in it. And when you really start to understand that, from that you can respect other things. If you don't understand that, I don't know what you're talking about, or divinities or deities, because it's easier to believe in a way bigger thing when you don't when you don't respect the small things. You know what I mean? And that's my the thing that I learned from that.
Yeah, I wonder, add in if you could to your question, because we've talked very understandably a lot about the need, if you will, for an inner transformation amongst ourselves to be able properly to appreciate what's at stake and what's in front of us here. And I also don't want to lose the connection that inner transformation has to connect with a political and economic transition also, because there are these major forces that will exterminate indigenous communities. And I don't know if there's any perspective you can share on that nexus.
There's so many things to think about and so many ways to respond. You asked earlier about personal growth through the work I do. It's very interesting because it's only after starting and working and doing my work with Rainforest Partnership that I realized that my own childhood probably had a lot to do with where I am today, but that my early years were going through schooling that was, there was a Catholic preschool with a father and nuns, and I still remember playing in under the little palm trees, and they're being dressed a certain way. And my kindergarten with Aga Khan school, so which is Shia Muslim, and then going to sort of a normal public school. So that's also crosses race, which was, so it's these white nuns and a father, and then Ismaili teachers, and then Black African teachers. And then I went to the school, which was very much Hindu focused, and then one that had prayers from every religion, and then to a boarding school that was Protestant missionary school, where I actually, scriptures was a class, and I actually aced it every year. I got really high marks for it. And my Baptist friends were always surprised that I actually could quote scriptures. I can't anymore. Sorry, Reverend Fletcher, something, it's all gone. But, and then I thought about how growing up, we celebrated every religious holiday. And I loved other holidays because platters of wonderful food came to our house. And because I was born and brought up Hindu, on Diwali, we took platters, and I loved going as a child with these platters of lovely food. And then the empty platters came back with candies, so, to our house. But, what role does that play in how we're open? And how does that differ from somebody who's taught there's only one way? And by the way, my boarding school, that was, you have to be born again, and accepting Jesus and being saved is your only way. How do you reconcile that when you come from that belief and you go to the forest and that you have to convert because you're doing God's work, because otherwise all these people are going to die and go to hell, right? The unchurched. And I've been called unchurched. I've had people at my door trying to convert me. But you go through that and then you realize you go to the forest, you are with Indigenous people that have different beliefs depending on, and Indigenous people are very different. I mean, we forget they could be right next to each other. And I think we've talked about this last week. Completely different beliefs, how they eat, what they wear, what their houses are, the language, everything is very different. They might be right next to each other. But often there is a connection and an understanding that world around them, it's very connected. And so the biggest thing that I can say that's happened to me personally is understanding and tapping into the fact that we're all connected. What Rodrigo was talking, we're so connected to everything all around us. You know, whether it's the trees or insects. And when you start feeling it and noticing it, you will start seeing it's like the world opens up. And if you talk too much about it, people think that it's quackery. I'm sure that it's all woo stuff, and it isn't. It is very real. And I can sit with you and help you see what I see. I can do it. You know, I can send you energy, right? As Indigenous people would, and you would feel it. It translates into something physical that as we as human beings feel. So when you think about all that, and you start beginning to understand that it's all connected, we are connected. If the trees are sending chemical and electrical signals, if the trees make their own rain, how does taking them out allow us to rely on faith that we will get rain anyway? I think God would say, we might want to help ourselves just a little so God can help us back. That's kind of what I would think. And so if we start thinking about the role that all this plays together and start valuing, you want to put it in economic terms, we can. What is the true value of Indigenous knowledge? What is the true value of those standing forests and that biodiversity in it? We don't really know it. We can try, but if we begin to acknowledge that there is a value, then that starts a very different conversation, right? And that would allow us to change the very equation for how we measure wealth and GDP and how we decide to actually function as humankind. And does it mean, if not the complete rewrite of the structure and our global economy, how we think about it? So in 2021, I think, and there are many other people actually, by the way, talking about it. I'm part of several fora where you have people from the UN, the EU, and private equity funds and NGOs that are actually talking about how you define capital. How does it take nature into account? How do you take, for me, I want to add, why am I in those conversations? I want to add Indigenous knowledge. I want to add parts of nature, that it's not just, social capital. It's not just biodiversity. There are things that we're not even thinking about that needs to be thought about in terms of what is the modern economy of 2021 that actually incorporates, that's human, that incorporates sustainability, that puts nature into the equation, that puts in Indigenous people and knowledge into the equation. Indigenous people, by the way, hold somewhere, according to the UN, between 70 and 80% of biodiversity. Shouldn't we defer to them or trust them or help them to protect that? Because it is in our own interest. If we're, if I'm a head of state or a corporate leader, isn't that what I should be thinking about? If I'm thinking beyond 2 years or 5 years or 10 years? So that's kind of how I think about in the political and economic terms. But by the way, you know that's happening in many ways. We saw that on Earth Day, quite a few companies and countries making pledges. Now that's the first step. A pledge is the acknowledgement and the first step. And now it's up to the rest of us, including the faith community, to say, okay, how are you going to hold yourselves accountable? How are we going to help you and keep you accountable to the pledges you're making?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and we've got I'm seeing, which is really wonderful, some questions now starting to come in, and a couple of the questions are questions about the modern day engagement with the Catholic Church, faith-based organizations in the Amazon around the environment and indigenous wisdom. Are there relationships underway? And a subsequent related question about insights from the Amazon Synod that Rodrigo mentioned a few minutes ago. I think I actually, while I'm the moderator, I might be the best position to say just a few words about that. I think it's important for viewers to be aware of two different initiatives. On the Catholic front, there's a very important initiative called REPAM, which is an initiative directed by a wonderful younger Catholic, Mauricio Lopez, who's done excellent work with the support of the Catholic bishops of the Amazon region to try to create a pan-Amazonian process of serious engagement and reflection and planning for the Catholic Church's presence in the Amazon. And they played an enormously important role in Pope Francis's Amazonian Synod last year, which resulted in a significant effort to update the Catholic community's engagement with the Amazon, a different approach to, shifting much more towards a deep listening and accompaniment model, as compared to what many of us, I think, would think about as a simplistically, evangelistically oriented model of engagement. And there's a link in the chat now to REPAM's website, and I'd encourage people to look at that. Another initiative that's worth being aware of is something called the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which Green Faith and Religions for Peace and the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology and the Parliament of the World's Religions and UN Environment Program together are coordinating in the Amazon, in Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, as well as in Indonesia and the DRC. And thanks for putting the link there. And that's an effort to try to organize people from a diverse range of religious backgrounds in those countries and globally to stand up for the rights of indigenous communities and the forests that they protect. So there is work going on, but it's still young in many ways, whereas the history of colonially oriented missionary activity is centuries old. We have just a few minutes left. I wonder, Rodrigo, Nyanta, share a couple of closing thoughts, if you would, each of you, about what needs to happen. We're at a really, we're at a crisis point in terms of the climate crisis, the crisis facing indigenous communities, the role that religion has played and is playing in that. Nyanta, first to you, share for just 2 or 3 minutes a couple of closing thoughts, and then Rodrigo we'll give you the microphone to wrap us up.
Thank you, Reverend Fletcher, for that. You're right about the Rainforest Faith Initiative, really important. I was so pleased to see when that happened. And by the way, RFI is a partner for World Rainforest Day, a day, June 22nd, that we created in 2017, we Rainforest Partnership. And there was a wonderful film from Colombia, RFI Colombia, that was made by a Brazilian, that was part of Films for the Forest, something that we've done. It's one of our initiatives, and it played on Earth Day. if somebody were to watch that film, it is so powerful, so beautifully made. So for most people on this planet, they're just trying, the majority of people, they're just trying to get through their daily lives, day to day. How do they get food on the table? How do they ensure there's a roof on their over their heads? And if they have a little extra money, how do they get to send the kids to school? They have no time to think about anything beyond that. And then there are a whole bunch of people that are only going to think about themselves. This is how we've evolved and who we are as humans. But there's some of us who know better, that we're called, as you're called, Reverend Fletcher. I think I'm called to do what I do. Rodrigo is called. My calling is just as important as yours. I cannot see anything in just, yes, my family is very important, my community is important, but anything I dream about, it's at the planet level. It's always at a planetary level. When somebody tells me to go to 2030 or see yourself, what do I see? It's always at the planetary level. How do we bring a bunch of us together and say, those of us who can choose to focus on what is good for our planet, how do we come together? And RFI is an important initiative that can be and should be same, for heads of state, for corporations, for NGOs, for every sector you can imagine. And it's happening, but it's going to happen with an urgency, because 2021 is the year everybody's coming together with the climate conference and much more going on this year. So I think it's just a bunch of us stepping up, no more time to be polite and sitting back.
Thanks, Nyantan. Thanks for your good words all this hour we've had. Rodrigo, back over to you. You were in the forest for many months. You've been forced away now because of the pandemic. What thoughts have you developed as you've been having to socially distance for much of this past year?
Yeah, well, I've been rainforest sick. Like I want to go back there and to live there and work there also. And thanks, Niet, it was really good exchanging some information and this talk with you. I learned a lot, and it's also nice to see people that also have the same posture, towards this issue. I think it's not enough to say that we kind of face a global crisis, etc. I want to just give two thoughts about it. I don't want to be too hyperbolical, but the first is, if we don't stop the way we are acting upon the world, we will be stopped. Make no mistake. So you have to really have that in mind. And the first that will suffer will be the most poor, the most vulnerable. And I think with that in mind, it's kind of not good news, because you have to reframe and ask and act upon a different way of produce and distribute the powers in the world, political, economic, etc. And that's a big task, and it's not one generation task. That being said, and I think religions have a big role in that, in a positive way. We need to have all the actors that we can work on that goal, because I don't know, it's when you go in the field and see that our way of doing things is causing all that destruction, because we first destroyed our country, all our territory, then it get depleted, and then we elsewhere. You see that it's a big hard thing to change. That being said, I would like to finish with a word from a really great Brazilian thinker. It's a geography master called Milton Santos. On the 90s, he studied globalization, and he was one of the first scholars to really put globalization in a critical human geography perspective. And he's have a really nice quote in that when I'm feeling pessimistic, I think of that quote, and that gives me energy. And the quote's more or less like this. He says, "We have not yet reached the level of humanity that worth to be called so. We are in rehearsals of humanity, and we have to think about it. We are rehearsing as a big humanity, as a humanity that needs to be, that can be called so, and that's especially true when you think about our relationship with other humanities, which are which we call indigenous humanities. That doesn't actually say too much. And if that in mind, if that two things in mind, I think we can pass through this crisis.
Thanks so much, Rodrigo, and Yenta, thanks so much to you. We're very grateful that you've given us time and your perspective. Thanks again to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting for the support that they've given for Rodrigo's work that makes this all possible. And finally, a warm thank you to the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, without whom this conversation wouldn't have been possible. You'll receive, everybody who registered will receive the link to the recording. We're very grateful to our audience for tuning in. And I would urge all of us to take to heart this call to deep reflection and to a change of perspectives that Rodrigo and Yenta have shared with us today, because the future of the world depends on it. So thank you all. Have a good rest of the day. Rodrigo and Yenta, thanks to you, and be well.